Hello and welcome to Macro Matters, the economics and politics podcast from Aberdeen Standard Investments. My name is Paul Diggle. I'm an economist at Aberdeen Standard Investments, and along with my co-host Stephanie Kelly, we're guiding you through the macroeconomic and political themes which are driving global markets. And today we're going to talk about the uses and abuses of fiscal policy. What is the role for fiscal policy when monetary policy is very constrained? How much should we worry about governments running big deficits and building up large debt stocks? Do very low or even negative interest rates change the amount of fiscal headroom that economies have? And is there a danger of fiscal policy doing too much and overheating the economy? This topic has been one of the key macroeconomic policy debates and drivers of financial markets really since the global financial crisis, if not before. But it's taken on fresh resonance during the COVID crisis as governments have deployed enormous amounts of public spending and in the process added to debt burdens. And moreover, it's a live debate in the US right now between high-profile economists like the former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and the current Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who are debating the pros and cons of President Biden's proposed fiscal stimulus package. And we actually have a clip here of Janet Yellen, the former Fed chair and now Treasury Secretary, making the argument that fiscal stimulus should go big.
Without further action, we risk a longer, more painful recession now and longer-term scarring of the economy later. The pandemic has caused widespread devastation. Neither the president-elect nor I proposed this relief package without an appreciation for the country's debt burden. But right now, with interest rates at historic lows, the smartest thing we can do is act big. In the long run, I believe the benefits will far outweigh the costs, especially if we care about helping people who have been struggling for a very long time.
So that was Janet Yellen laying out her views on fiscal policy, and joining me to talk about the limits or lack of limits to using fiscal policy are James McCann, our senior US economist, and Luke Bartholomew, our senior monetary economist. So Luke, let's start with you. Should we worry about governments building up large deficits and debt loads? And I suppose the starting point is people often make the analogy with a household, which builds up large debt loads and needs to pay them back at some point. Is that a good justification for worrying about a country or a government's debt and deficit?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, well, we certainly shouldn't be worrying about debt for this household reason that you refer to there. In fact, that confusion is so common in economics. We have a name for it. It's called the household fallacy. And the reason it's a fallacy is this, that, for a household who's suddenly faced a shock to their income, they can cut their spending, and that is a way of getting on top of their balance sheet. But that just doesn't work at all for the central government. And the reason is this: when a household cuts its spending, it doesn't really do anything to their income. They're insignificant in a macroeconomic sense. Whereas when the government cuts spending, that also cuts economy-wide income as well, because it's such a big contributor to the whole economy. So when the government spends less, the economy tends to shrink with it. And similarly, on sort of the other side of that is when it spends more, the economy grows. There's sort of a positive multiplier effect, it's called. When it injects money in the economy, there are multiple rounds of further spending that flows from that. And the government's sort of in an ideal position to boost the economy, to use that positive multiplier in downturns, precisely because its financing constraints tend to relax just when the economy's at its weakest. That is when interest rates are very, very low. There's a large output gap. So there are these unutilized resources the government can put to work. So sort of in a welfare sense, in what's best for the economy, it's unambiguously the case that in situations like this, that it's, we shouldn't worry about debt levels, and in fact, we should be spending more. But even taking those arguments on their own terms, in terms of sort of the debt to GDP, how much debt we take on, even beyond just the straight welfare comparisons, there's good reasons for thinking that at times it's sort of self-defeating to try and get on top of your debt load if you're the government by cutting spending. You could hurt the economy so much and do so much permanent damage, you end up eroding your tax base, exactly what it is that you use to pay taxes in the future, and therefore undermine future fiscal sustainability that way. And there's a very good reason for thinking that's exactly the sort of situation we're in now. If you let the COVID shock sort of go unabated with fiscal policy, you'd end up doing far more permanent damage to the economy. So if I can, be slightly sloganistic, do you think paying for COVID was expensive? Just see how expensive it would be to do nothing.
Yeah, so that's the household analogy or the household fallacy, and I think it is important to explain why that analogy, which a lot of people naturally incline to, doesn't work in a macroeconomic sense once you think about the dynamics of a country at large. And indeed, that broader idea of using austerity and reining in the public finances is now somewhat tarnished, or at least it's an important area of debate in the broader economics community. But there are still constraints on a government, right? It's not like a government can spend constantly forever without consequences. So what are the constraints on a government's budget?
Yeah, I think that is an important point to make, because there is a somewhat fashionable view at the moment that almost wants to assert there are no long-run intertemporal budget constraints on the government at all. There is nothing that ultimately binds how much it can spend. And we think that is wrong for several reasons, one of which is there must be, I think, some limit on how much the private sector wants to hold the liabilities of the government in terms of the kind of portfolio that a household wants to construct. That just doesn't want an infinite amount of government securities. Is going to go and want to do other things in the way that it structures its finances. But then sort of to make that point a bit more formally, if the debt sort of level is on an explosive dynamic, that is to say there is nothing that would stop it increasing without bound, and the way that could happen is you could imagine the interest compounding on the debt load, and then that increasing the interest that's required to pay that debt, the service cost goes up, that increases the debt load ever more. If you get into that kind of cycle, then there are clear hard limits on what you can do. That ultimately you could imagine that the debt servicing costs reached 100% of GDP at that point. You literally can't service the debt right on any given year. But way before that point, there were clearly political constraints on how credible it is that the government would be able to commit to handing over a certain amount of national resources to servicing the debt every year. And indeed, before you get to that point, forward-looking investors, policymakers could see that you'd fall into that kind of trap. And the very fact that you might be on that path itself sort of sets you up on that dynamic. So the key there is not so much the level of debt so much as is the sort of the growth rate and the dynamics that you're on, and the sense in which they are explosive or not.
So James, bringing you in then, the question of whether particular levels of debt matter or not is an interesting and potentially contentious one within the economics profession, because there was this important piece of work by Reinhardt and Rogoff, which identified or seemed to identify certain debt to GDP ratios as being very problematic. And once you cross that threshold, suddenly debt dynamics became unsustainable. Maybe you could explain why the profession in general is at a point where it doesn't believe that story, that there's no specific threshold for debt to GDP, which is suddenly problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. That Reinhardt-Rogoff piece around a decade or so has been, or at least at the time, was very influential in shaping some of the thinking, and the findings from that were actually questioned quite aggressively. And and found to be that the relative effect of crushing these thresholds was smaller than they initially had estimated. But in general, I think we have moved on in some regards from that debate, or at least we've had a period in which we've been able to understand how the interaction of monetary policy when central banks are struggling for ammunition and fiscal policy interact in an environment of relatively weak underlying demand. And I think the experience on that has been quite chastening for parts of the economic profession. I think Luke did a great job of outlining the importance that fiscal policy can play in sort of a stabilizing, a counter-cyclical role. The evidence seems to be that actually those multipliers tend to be larger when central banks are stuck at the lower bound. So the bang for your buck you actually get from that spending is more significant, but equally the drag from trying to do austerity at the moment equally is even more significant. So almost the role of fiscal policy has become much more important, and that sense that it plays an important part in the demand management framework has become much more critical. And so I think the focus on these types of thresholds has receded, and I think rightfully the focus has shifted more to that, in the interest rate you pay on your borrowing versus the expected growth rate that you get from your economic activity, and using that framework to understand how debt sustainability plays out, I think is a stronger apparatus at the moment. And really, I think when policymakers look, even factoring in some small increase in rates over recent weeks and months, it's very, very cheap, especially in real terms, for almost every government to go out there and borrow. And if we're right that you're getting an extra kicker from fiscal spending because of these more potent multipliers, then the growth effects should be relatively favorable. So I think really the focus has shifted away from that threshold towards that, what does it cost to borrow and what do you get from it, that interest rate versus growth dynamic. And I do think that's probably a healthier approach.
So Luke, the short and snappy description of that debate that James was referencing is known as R versus G, where R is the interest rate, the servicing cost on a debt load, and G is the growth rate of an economy. So could you just lay out why do we think those two variables are the crucial ones when it comes to questions of debt dynamics, and explain how that sort of feeds into this broader rethinking in the economics profession about what is or isn't a sustainable debt load?
Sure. So, I mean, if you're starting from a fixed debt level, right? If R is greater than G, so the interest rate you pay on that debt is greater than your growth rate, and remembering that your tax base ultimately relies on a growing economy, so that's why G matters, your ability to service that debt, to service the interest rate. If R is greater than G, then the debt level will continue to grow, and you could be on that kind of explosive dynamics I laid out previously. Whereas if R is less than G, then you sort of automatically can grow yourself out of your debt pile. Over time, your debt to GDP necessarily falls as your sort of capacity to service the debt grows greater than the cost on it. So when R is less than G, suddenly much, much bigger debt piles become significantly more sustainable. And, there's been I guess there was an implicit assumption in the back of a lot of economists' head when they were thinking about these questions for a long time, that perhaps the natural state of the world, for whatever reason, was that R would be greater than G. And our thinking on that has sort of been completely turned upside down. There was quite a famous lecture by economist Olivier Blanchard, who was previously chief economist at the IMF for a while, basically explaining that since the 1950s across much of the developed world, the norm has been that R is less than G. And the only sort of one decade where that wasn't the case was the 1980s, and there were very specific reasons around what Paul Volcker at the US Federal Reserve was doing in terms of trying to get on top of inflation, why that was the case. So it was like a specific policy choice to make R greater than G in that case. But beyond that decade, the rest of our sort of post-war economic history has been one where R is less than G. That does seem to be, quote unquote, the natural state of things. And if that is the case, that does mean that for any given debt level, we can sort of grow our way out of it. And that does fundamentally change some of those conversations about the sustainability of debt.
Yeah, so I should sort of both slightly apologize to our listeners for throwing around these these terms, but it's important to emphasize quite how crucial the contours of that debate have been inside the economics profession. The growing body of evidence and realization that growth rates do seem to although low in many countries, do seem to be systematically larger than interest rates, means that debt dynamics, the starting point of debt dynamics, is actually that they're very sustainable, that over time debt to GDP ratios shrink because of that mathematical relationship. And it can't really be understated the size of the paradigm shift within the profession and the reassessment of sustainable debt to GDP loads once this R less than G, as we call it, as economists like to call it, the relationship is fully described. But Luke, maybe a final point on this then is why the debt to GDP ratio itself, which is the typical ratio of how we describe a country's debt load, that ratio is actually a problematic concept. It's not uncontroversial that this is even a good measure. And the background is that the debt load is a stock of debt, but GDP is the output in any one year, or it's what economists call a flow concept. So this stock to flow comparison is not really a very good comparison. It's sort of an apples to oranges comparison. What would be a better way to describe debt sustainability dynamics then?
So I think we would prefer to look at something like the percentage beyond the R versus G dynamics that we set out there, which ultimately do pin down long-run sustainability and whether or not you're on an explosive path. Beyond that, I think fiscal rules more generally and the way to think about fiscal policy would be helped if we were thinking in terms of servicing the debt, the quantity of GDP that's spent on servicing the debt. And we've made suggestions that, for example, the UK adopt fiscal rules along those lines. And the idea there is essentially, if interest rates are very low, that tends to mean that debt servicing is low, and then automatically that rule would mean that there is more space to take on bigger debt loads, to have more expansive policy. But equally, if we were to have, for whatever reason, a shift to a much higher interest rate environment, then that rule would automatically force you to reduce your spending. So it has sort of like nice properties to be able to respond to the interest rate environment, whilst at a time like this, allowing fiscal policymakers to run a more expansive policy. So it is a more natural flow-to-flow comparison, as you would put it.
Yeah, and I've also seen some people do sort of quite funky stock-to-stock comparisons, which is something like debt to the present discounted value of GDP over an infinite future. And when you're discounting with a very low interest rate, as we are at the moment, that present discounted value of future GDP looks enormously large, such that the stock-to-stock comparison doesn't look particularly threatening. I mean, that's quite a funky and probably slightly weird approach. But the point is the same, that when you recast them in the proper light, a lot of these questions of how large the debt overhang is, how sustainable or not it is, actually look much better in light of the low interest rate environment. So for maybe sort of the second half of the episode then, we're going to, if we take that government debt carrying loads are larger than perhaps rules of thumb of the past would suggest they were, we have this fiscal room. Should we use it? Or might there be sort of adverse consequences of being very active with our fiscal stimulus? And James, this, as I sort of was saying at the start there, this is a live debate in the US at the moment between pretty high profile economists. Maybe you could outline the contours of that debate and why it's such a key issue in markets at the moment.
Yes, absolutely, because we, I suppose, have a proposed piece of legislation from the Democrats, championed by Joe Biden, to put an extra $1.9 trillion in stimulus through the US economy. Most of that stimulus will be very front-loaded, so impacting activity in the very near term. This, of course, adds to the $900 billion bipartisan deal, which was agreed before the new year. So we have a proposal for a very, I guess, significant fiscal impetus in the United States. And I think what the clip that we heard from Yellen made the positive case for that earlier in the discussion. And I think we've hinted on some of the positive case for that. What's interesting is there's certainly been some pushback, and not just, I guess, around the political lines that we might have expected from this type of package, but more in the academic circles. So in particular, Larry Summers has grabbed a lot of the headlines, but he's not alone in the criticism. So Olivier Blanchard has shown some skepticism too, but they've outlined a few concerns around these plans. They link maybe less to the debt sustainability element, although there's maybe a little element of that too. So certainly Larry Summers highlights one or two concerns around doing so much so soon, and particularly with less focus on sort of long-term infrastructure investment. His think is that you fire all your bullets now and you can't go back and do more later, particularly around those areas that he probably thinks are most needed in the long term in the United States, which I think most people agree on. Infrastructure is a high priority. However, it seems that Summers' main concern perhaps centers more around the size and composition of the package. And in particular, his fear seems to be that this could potentially even be too large for the US economy, lead to a degree of overheating, and actually lead to quite an unhealthy inflation dynamic. So some sense that you're doing too much stimulus, this could actually tip the scales and mean that in a short period of time, or the not too distant future, the US economy is essentially being pushed into the red and creating unsustainable inflationary pressures. So really an interesting shift, one which I think has some echoes of that debt sustainability, but more a case of saying this has gone too far now and you're advocating using too much fiscal space and using too aggressive a fiscal response really than is justified.
Yeah, I was surprised in a way, I don't know about you, James, to see some of these economists like Summers and Blanchard almost flipping to this side of the argument, having for a long time pushed the case of fiscal policy being required to avoid traps like secular stagnation and low growth. But the possible inflation consequences is clearly one of Larry Summers' concern about such a large fiscal package. Do we buy that is a problem, especially in the context of such a long period of low inflation, the difficulty of creating inflation, and perhaps the respect in which higher inflation might be welcome at this point?
Look, I think that's exactly the framework that we come at it from. I think, first of all, his assumptions are based on some sense that we can have a very strong understanding at this point when we know the US is running well below capacity. We know from the unemployment rate that there is slack, but his sense that this is absolutely too big for that slack is absolutely, I think, uncertain at this point. It could be the case that the output gap is significantly larger than he's factoring in. It could be the case that there's more supply in the labor market than he believes. We know that during the last cycle, we got the unemployment rate down to 3.5% and didn't really generate a huge amount of inflationary pressure. So I think that sense that you can predict ahead of time exactly how much stimulus you need to fill that gap is pretty challenging. So setting out a smaller package there, I think, would be a risky step, particularly as some of these relief measures should not necessarily be seen as stimulus, more as genuine relief. So things that help schools open safely, things that accelerate vaccine rollout. These aren't your classic sort of demand style stimulus measures. These are responses directly to COVID. So I have some concerns, I suppose, about this sense that this automatically needs to lead to an overheating or pushing the US economy above capacity. And then the second issue I think you flagged there is on inflation. we do know that we seem to be able to push economies relatively hard, and it's been difficult to get in inflation. Absolutely, the 2010s suggested that. It gives a sense that the relationship between slack in an economy and price pressures seems to be weak. It seems to be lagged. That's another way of saying that the Phillips curve is relatively flat and unresponsive. So there's an argument that you might not know how much you're pushing the economy through this channel. We can't sort of predict this too precisely. But what you actually do want to do is generate some heat if you can, because you sort of need that, it seems, to generate sustainable inflation. And then the final point is the Fed also needs this inflation too. It's not had enough inflation for a long period of time. Its average inflation target builds in an overshoot in inflation. So the Fed doesn't just want to get to 2%, it wants to overshoot to try and compensate for misses on the downside previously. So I sort of feel on a few aspects that the argument doesn't completely hold up. It's not impossible that we're wrong and that there's far less supply space in the US economy and the inflation does rebound more quickly. But I think that the Fed has the tools then to step in and take action.
So on that then, Luke, the Fed has the tools to step in and take action to contain inflation if necessary. In a sense, that's wasteful because it would be, say inflation rises, the Fed then hikes interest rates and looks to crowd out some of the of private sector investment because this public sector investment is going on. That's all true, but I think an interesting market question then is, might that lead to end cycle type dynamics and the potential for a future recession as a result of a Fed hiking cycle? Because we know they have the tools to contain inflation if necessary, but do we actually want them to use those tools?
So I think it is the case that a good way of modeling business cycles in the US and to an extent the developed world sort of up to the financial crisis was often thinking about the way that we got into quote unquote late cycles, or what tipped us into recession was that the Fed had to deal with sort of rising inflationary pressure, had to slam the brakes on, and would often slam them too hard, and it's very hard to fine tune the economy in this way. And that's what sort of got us into recession. And there was this idea of a political business cycle, perhaps that fiscal policy would be too loose in the run up to elections, and dealing with that became a big part of the Fed's job. And it was this stop go between fiscal and monetary policy that was creating these unstable business cycle dynamics. My sense is that those forces are a lot less powerful today, and a large reason for that is frankly, sort of as James alluded to there, the Phillips curve is much flatter, or to put it a slightly different way, inflation expectations are much better anchored. So it's just quite difficult for us to get these sort of huge overheatings in inflation that require the Fed to really slam the brakes on. Its quote unquote reaction function, as we call it, the way it responds to the economy, is relatively well understood now in a way that perhaps even up to the late 90s, it wasn't. And that helps households, businesses plan around the economy. It stops these sort of expectation overshoots, all of which is a long way of saying that, yeah, it's a risk. The Fed could end up overhiking. It could end up over responding to any sort of inflation pressure. Arguably, it sort of did that a little bit in 2016, 2017, if not got us into a recession, certainly got us into a slowdown. But then how did the Fed respond to that? Well, it saw where it was going and started to ease policy again, right? So I think if the Fed were to sort of start to make a mistake in this way and over tighten, it would then react again. So my hope is that whilst it is a risk, I think it would be a nice thing to have to worry about, the Fed tightening too much because the economy was at risk of overheating. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I think Mario Draghi once said that it would be a high-class problem to have, which is, I quite like that turn of phrase. So James, maybe as a sort of penultimate question then, to what extent does the lower bound on interest rates and the constraints central banks have in adding even more stimulus to the economy and raising inflation mean that monetary and fiscal policy have to work together in the future? And should that be explicit, implicit? I'm sort of interested to see, all these former central bankers in political roles, Yellen at in the US Treasury, Draghi, the head of an Italian government, and as well maybe politicians in monetary policy roles like Christine Lagarde now at the ECB. So are we entering an era of more explicit monetary fiscal coordination, and is that a good thing?
Well, I think what policymakers have learned across central banks and governments, perhaps, and hopefully, is the cost of those two organizations not working together. And we saw it in the last decade, and just keep coming back to this, the sense that, we knew it would be a difficult recovery from a financial crisis, but I think policymakers clearly have compounded that. And it meant that central banks got stuck at the lower bound for a long period of time. Recoveries were weaker. Planned austerity was, first of all, extremely unpopular, but also arguably not particularly productive. So the improvement in debt positions weren't great either. So what I think we're seeing is some recognition of those missteps and an attempt to try and combine these policies in a more coherent and more, I guess, coordinated way. And I think that's a good point. I think whether there's a case to make this more explicit, I would argue that you could go potentially even further there. Luke sort of highlighted the work that he had done around different ways in which you could combine monetary and fiscal to create a stronger demand management system of policies. But certainly I think the dynamics of central banks struggling with ammunition shortages at the lower bound and the seeming high borrowing capacity in a world of relatively low interest rates, those two foundations really make a strong case that you can combine these policies, get a lot more bang for your buck, and make much more effective sort of counter-cyclical stimulus. So I'm encouraged that there's, I think, signs that you're getting greater coordination there. I'm not worried about fears that could lead us down the sort of monetary financing route. I still think there's institutional stability across particularly the central banks, which protects us from that. So I think there could be even further to go in that coordination, and hopefully the path is towards further learning that those how these tools interact, and we'll continue to see that journey towards a more effective policy strategy.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a whole future podcast we could do, thinking about what is the right framework in which those two institutions work together. What's the right degree of institutional independence versus coordination? I think there's a lot to think about there. But maybe as a final question then, James, say you're Treasury Secretary, what size of fiscal package are you going to push? What's the right number here?
Well, I think the 1.9 trillion is a good place to start. Mm-hmm. And I think I would look at the future and see that the Democrats have ability to do more if more is required. We know that they have a bunch of political items on their agenda, be it around infrastructure investment, be it around expansion of the Affordable Care Act. They've also got some tax hikes that they are considering doing as well. So I think they have now, it would set the strong base for the recovery, and then they have the ability through this window where they have control of the House and the Senate to do more if needed. So I think they'll feel in a strong position. It makes sense to do something large in the first instance, and then you have political priorities and you can size them appropriately according to what is required. So I think this forms a good foundation. I think that what the Democrats will appreciate is that they have the apparatus over the next 2 years to do more and add to this if needed. And equally, if it is enough, then they can make some of those initiatives more budget neutral. So it feels like this aggressive start puts them in a relatively strong starting place.
Brilliant. James, Luke, thank you both very much. Well, that's about all we have time for this week. Thank you for listening to Macro Matters. A reminder that we have a mailbox, macromatters@aberdeenstandard.com, and we'd love to hear from you if you have questions, topics, feedback on the podcast. For myself and Steph, please drop us an email at macromatters@aberdeenstandard.com. And remember that email is not a secure form of communication, so don't send us personal information on there, but please do get in touch about the show. Don't forget to like or subscribe to Macro Matters on your podcast platform. And until next time, goodbye and good luck out there.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.